This is an introduction to the framework or analyze that I tend to use when I fence and when I analyze opponents for my fellow teammates. And maybe you can use parts of it. It's not a framework is I think a bit of an individual thing, but there are parts of it that is the same. And I will introduce this to you, and maybe it can help you to defeat opponents that are maybe stronger or faster or younger or has a better technique than yourself. A little bit of myself and the journey I've been on to not to develop this framework, because I actually parts of it is actually from a book, and I will introduce this a little bit later. But I've been fencing for 30 years. I've been a national champion in épée. I've been on the national Danish team in épée, and I've been fencing rapier for 4 years. And the journey, when I began the journey, I realized that some parts that my instructor told me that I should do when I faced other opponents, sometimes it didn't work. And it was especially when I met opponents that had some kind of a strong move, and I will show you in a minute what I mean about this. So and it was a kind of it was not a shock to me, but it was a kind of, I didn't really know what happened there. And I talked to my fellow teammates, and they, of course, they had some of the same experiences. And when I talked to some of the older fencers, they had the same experiences too. And there were part of this. Some of this framework is actually a list, and I'll go through this list there a little bit later. And it was kind of a new experience for me to suddenly get into a situation where I was not able actually to perform what I hoped to perform. And let me just give you an example here. So normally this is a really, really simple classical drill here. It is, you go in here and you threaten, for example, me, and I'm doing a 4 parry. And when I do the 4 parry, you disengage and you go in and you hit. Now, many times I've heard this both in modern fencing. I also heard it in HEMA fencing. It's the same thing. It is trigger his 4 parry and then disengage and go in here. Okay, this is the drill. Of course, this is what you do. And what happens is that if you perform this against a medium fencer or a beginner, yes, it worked. What I realized, it was that every time I met a fencer that had a strong 4 parry, it didn't work. It didn't really have to be a strong fencer, an overall strong fencer, as long as the fencer just was really, really strong at his 4. So the thing that I had learned didn't work. And I couldn't really figure that out. And of course, I knew that I should not really go into this person's 4 here, but it was first when I read a book by a person, a really strong fencer, by Johan Hammenberg, that I was actually able to put words on some of the frustrations that I've had, because Johan Hammenberg introduced concepts for how to actually look at it, and I felt really that there was a fencer. Finally, there was a fencer that understood me, and I will use some of his concepts in the framework that I will introduce to you, and it really just consists of 2 steps. It is not really that complicated. The things that Johan Hammenberg he is introducing, it is what he calls an area of excellence. And if I take this example again here, it is all fencers, they have something they're good at. You have something that you're really good at. It can be an attack, it can be a special kind of parry, it can be maybe you're really good if you with a rapier, maybe you're really good at just grabbing and stabbing. It can be anything, but something that you're really good at. This is your area of excellence. And what happens if I take this situation again here? What happened here when I was told by my instructor that when I met strong fencers in the 4 that I disengage, it was not that I tried to disengage a person that has some kind of a habit 4. It was that I walked directly into his area of excellence. Because what happens here, it is when I try to disengage, now this person, he has tried this, he has faced hundreds and hundreds of times. He has faced an opponents like me trying to do exactly the same thing. So unless that I was some kind of a super duper Spitzenklasse fencer that could really just do the disengage to some kind of top perfection, then I would lose, because I walked into his area of excellence. So what should I do instead? What I should do instead, it is, of course, avoiding my opponent's area of excellence. So if he has a really, really strong 4, I should avoid getting into a situation where he is performing a 4 parry. And I'll give you another example, and then I'll talk about the other part that Harmenberg is talking about. It is, I know this longsworder, and is really talented, and he has this attack where he goes up and he has a long launch. It's almost like dragging his leg after him, and he's hitting every time. He's really strong at this special kind of attack, and most opponents, they get shocked. So what they do is that they increase the distance not to get hit by him, because if they have the normal distance, they get hit, and if they even increase the distance, he also hit them. So you try to increase it even more and just follows them here. And what happens is that because they have this distance and they are keeping the distance to him, they are in his area of excellence. And there are two things that this opponent or this fencer needs to have before he can perform his super attack, and this is called the prerequisites. Now the first is of course that he needs to have the right distance to perform it, and the second thing is of course that there is an open line. And what the Johan Harmenberg is talking about, it is that if you understand your opponent's area of excellence, and many opponents doesn't really have that many, maybe 2 or 3 max. If you understand your opponent's area of excellence, and you can identify the prerequisites and just remove just one of them, then your opponent cannot walk into his area of excellence, and you have just leveled up the fight a lot. So, for example, if you take the example with the longsword here again, instead of just moving backwards here, it could actually be to close the distance. So he could not actually, he did not really have the room and space to actually perform his super attack. Or it could simply just close the line. If I'm fencing with a dagger, I could just simply just close the line, or whatever you do, whatever kind of weapon that you fence with. So here you're actually removing the prerequisites, and this is the first step in this framework. It is, instead of looking at yourself, and a lot of fencers does that. I've seen it both in the modern fencing world and I've seen it in the HEMA world. It is the same thing that the fencers, they ask themselves, is it, how should I do this? How can I avoid this? How can I do X, Y, Z? Instead of doing this, you could ask yourself, what is my opponent's area of excellence? And how could I avoid walking right into this area of excellence? How can I avoid my opponent actually to go in there? Sometimes you don't even have to actually to touch the opponent's blade just to have leveled up the fight. Now, when you have removed your opponent's area of excellence, the next thing that you do, it is that you introduce your own area of excellence and push your opponent into your area of excellence. And what that excellence is and what that area is, of course, I don't know this. It is individual from fencer to fencer, so I will not really cover that thing up there. So these are the 2 basic steps. First, look at the opponent. It seems obvious that you need to do that, but a lot of fencers, and I will actually claim that it's more than 95%, they don't do that. But first look at your opponent, and then secondly, look at yourself, and not the other way around. Now, some of the things that I'm looking out for when I fence, I will share my list with you. And again, please bear in mind that it maybe not be the same things that you need to look out for, because that you have another fencing style, so you cannot use it. But and my list too, it's like an ongoing list. I'm not the same fencer that I was 20 years ago, so I constantly are actually thinking that if I should do something else. It's not because it's a really long list I have, but there are some things where I can see that are pretty consistent, and I will share those things with you. The first thing I notice is, of course, if the opponent is very aggressive or very defensive. And if the opponent is aggressive, I notice at what distance the opponent is aggressive. When does the attack actually begin? If it's a defensive opponent, I tend to notice what happens, where is the opponent's strongest parries, because I will try to avoid those. And all fencers, they have this kind of a red button. So when you move closer and just close the distance more and more to a fencer, what happens is that at some point a reaction will happen. You don't know what happens, but something in a reaction will happen. Maybe the fencer walks backwards. Maybe the fencer will try, and if you put just your blade just a little bit up here, maybe the fencer will do some kind of search for your blade and try to avoid it. and maybe the offender would like to take a step forward and try to attack you. And I notice what happens here in this phase when I go in here and try to press the red button, because I need to know where the distance is, because I can work with that. I notice the preferred end position of my opponent's point. It is, does my opponent hit in the head, in the upper body, arms, or the legs? What happens there? Does my opponent have some kind of special move that I really need to look out for? And I normally try to close those lines, simply just to, again, to remove the prerequisite that my opponent could go into the area of excellence. I tend also to look out for the opponent's eyes, and because you can actually see the eyes through the mask. And normally I will, when I meet a new fencer, I always just check with the blade if the opponent is following my point. Normally, experienced fencers doesn't do that. Very seldom occasions they do, but the fencers that do follow my point with their eyes, well, you know what to do. So I will not go into that. I notice if the opponent, when the opponent is attacking, if the opponent needs to have blade contact or not. Do we have some kind of préféré attacks? Does the opponent need to have, for example, if it's opponent that binds, for example, or is it opponent that use beats? And in both occasions, normally what I do, it is, if they do this, if it's opponent that binds, I will try to figure out if I am stronger in this than the opponent. And then if I am, then I will, of course, let the opponent bind. If I'm not, which happens most of the time, then I will actually try to avoid having blade contact with my opponent. And what happens is that I've just removed the prerequisite that my opponent can actually perform his or her area of excellence. Sometimes I need to clear the space in front of me, simply just to get in. So I call it that I draw circles. And this is, you can do it anyway here. I can see different kind of fencers, they do it really differently. But the thing is actually to see where your opponent is reacting and where your opponent is not reacting. So it's really just, for me, it's just a checklist to see what's really happening when the opponent is when I actually do the circles. They are also really good if you need to, and this is something that I do if I'm really into problems. And it is, I do the complete opposite of what all instructors tell me to do. It's actually also something that Harmenberg says that you can do here. But instead, if you meet a fencer that outfends you in every way, and do remember that when the second that you pick up a blade and you confront another fencer, you're looking at odds, always looking at odds. So instead of having odds that are really not in your favor, having the perfect distance that you have learned, having the perfect en-garde position that you have learned, because your opponent is simply just much better in controlling this than you are, then you need again to level out your chances or your odds. And sometimes it is to break the distance. What happens if you do it? Well, of course, it is the first time I did it, it was kind of terrifying, because it's something that you have learned that you are not really supposed to do. But what happens is that suddenly you have removed many of the prerequisites that your opponent have. And when you're closer to each other, everything can happen. And suddenly, instead of that, you have 80% chance of getting stabbed. Maybe you're just up to 50, because you have a 50-50 situation. Maybe you can stab your opponent fast and push him away, whatever. But you actually sometimes doing the opposite of what the instructors normally tells you to do, and what you have always learned to do, and what I have always learned to do. Sometimes it can actually help you. And this is, of course, the last resort here. And this was the basic part of the list that I go through. There are more parts than that, but it's not really something that I think I would cover here. This is just the framework and the list that I go through, where to actually to figure out where my opponent's area of excellence is. And if you can use a part of this and it can help you, please cherry pick. And now it is at least shared with you. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed the video. Thank you.